The eerie silence inside the Japanese headquarters was broken by an urgent transmission that spurred every man into a frenzy. The Allies had initiated a full-scale invasion of the Solomon Islands and the crucial Guadalcanal Island in the South Pacific. The long-awaited escalation of the war in the Pacific theater had begun. The news jolted the Imperial Japanese Navy into action. They were determined not to lose territory and promptly mobilized their finest Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa and his formidable fleet. Their mission was crystal clear: to intercept and obstruct the Allied landing efforts before they could establish a secure foothold on the islands. With their hearts aflame, Mikawa's fleet ripped through the endless waters of the Pacific in a high-stakes race against time. Departing from Rabaul, they executed a daring sprint toward the Solomon Islands. The warships zigzagged, maneuvering around possible Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Unseen, they arrived at their objective on August 8, 1942, setting the stage for an insidious ambush. The Vice Admiral, a master tactician, planned to strike under the veiling darkness, leveraging his sailors' unsurpassed prowess in nocturnal combat and exploiting the US Navy's inexperience in it. The imminent attack was shrouded in the blackest of nights, with no warning lights to signal the approach. The Allied northern force was suddenly intercepted, the searing brightness of Japanese searchlights blinding them and sowing chaos across their ranks as shells began to rip through their ship's decks. It was a scene from a nightmare. The certainty of an invisible enemy, the sharp realization of their own blindness, and the cold sound of bullets hitting the metal hull. As the reality of the onslaught finally crashed over the Allied sailors, their fight shifted into one for survival. The Battle of Midway had been a thunderous victory for the Allies, a turning point in the Pacific theater that sent ripples across the vast expanse of the Japanese Empire. Once a seemingly insurmountable beast, the Japanese naval power had been severely wounded, its stranglehold on the mid-Pacific loosening with each passing day. The Allies, seizing this golden opportunity, made the critical decision to shift from defense to offense. They set in motion a long-anticipated campaign to reclaim the myriad of Pacific islands wrenched from their grasp by the Japanese forces in previous years. For Japan, Midway was more than a defeat. It was a humiliating blow to their pride and naval doctrine. Their only chance to obliterate the US Pacific Fleet and bring the US to the negotiation table before they set their military industry into overdrive had been squandered. The ticking clock echoed ominously, foretelling the inevitable advance of the American forces toward their territories. The Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't easily tamed. Though wounded, it remained a formidable navy, teeming with experienced sailors, fueled by an unwavering resolve to resist. The fleet still outnumbered the US in warships. Their heavy cruisers remained a force to be reckoned with. Moreover, driven into a corner and adopting a defensive stance, they sought to employ their legendary night combat doctrine, their secret weapon in naval warfare. The Japanese had honed the art of nocturnal warfare for decades, transforming the darkness into their ally. Their lookouts were hand-picked, individuals blessed with exceptional night vision, who were then molded through rigorous training into nighttime watchmen of unparalleled ability. Armed with colossal pedestal-mounted binoculars and trained to shield their eyes at the imminent flash of their ship's guns, these watchmen could see enemy ships where other sailors would only see darkness and mist. The Navy gunners were equally adept, signaling before firing to alert the watchers, who would swiftly take cover, their valuable eyesight preserved. This extraordinary doctrine handed the Japanese Navy a significant upper hand during nighttime operations. Should an encounter ensue under the veil of darkness, it was highly likely that the Japanese would spot the enemy long before the Allies were alerted of their presence. Admiral Ernest J. King waited impatiently, his gaze fixed on the South Pacific. The adrenaline rush from the victory at Midway stoked his desire to challenge the Japanese on their turf. The experienced leader knew they could only win the war if they took the initiative, and he famously said, quote, "Anyone who won't take a chance now and then isn't worth a damn. Difficulties exist to be overcome." However, the stark reality was that the US Pacific Fleet was still weak from the Pearl Harbor assault. The Allied High Command, treading cautiously, harbored reservations about launching an offensive without additional fortification. The initial calculations suggested a possible strike on the Solomon Islands by late fall of 1942, but the tides of war are ever changing, and they turned abruptly when Allied intelligence intercepted alarming news. The Japanese forces stationed on Guadalcanal Island were constructing an airfield. Should they succeed, they would be exerting aerial supremacy over the region, and they would be able to sever critical sea lanes and communication lines between the US and Australia. Letting Japan complete and use the airbase would make an invasion almost impossible. The Allies had to stop the construction at all costs. Consequently, the Pacific Theater's first offensive was catapulted to August, bypassing months of meticulous planning and preparation. This expedited timeline resulted in hasty preparations, with the invasion lacking the detailed tactical analysis that the Allied admirals would have preferred. Nevertheless, the operation received the green light under the codename Watchtower. Despite the improvised nature of the Allied strategy, fortune and the weather were on their side. Covered by continuous storms and fog, over 80 ships stealthily navigated the islands north of Australia, effectively evading detection by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. As such, the enemy remained in the dark about the looming attack until the Allied forces neared the beachheads of Tulagi and Guadalcanal on August 7th. Caught off guard, the local Japanese forces scrambled to alert their higher-ups. The Imperial Japanese Navy responded with lightning speed, tasking Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa with the mission to intercept the Allied transport ships and crush them before they could lay claim to Tulagi or Guadalcanal. For the Allies, their war efforts in the Pacific depended on their ability to disrupt the construction of the Japanese airfield in Guadalcanal. And for the Japanese, stopping the American landing was the only way to buy themselves time to finish the crucial airbase. As a seasoned naval strategist, Mikawa was stationed at the heavily fortified Rabaul Island and possessed the tactical acumen to maximize his men's strengths while skillfully sidestepping their weaknesses. The Allies' underestimation of the Imperial Japanese Navy had ignited a fire within him, and he was determined to make them pay a heavy price. The most glaring handicap Mikawa and the Japanese Navy grappled with was the acute shortage of aircraft carrier support. The catastrophic outcome at Midway had cost them 4 of their most capable aircraft carriers, and the remaining smaller carriers were inconveniently far from Guadalcanal. The Midway debacle had stripped Japan of its fighter power at sea and served as a bitter testament to the extraordinary might of the US carriers and their aircraft. As Mikawa spearheaded his fleet towards Guadalcanal, composed of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer, the idea of detection and interception by US carriers haunted him. He knew perfectly well that his fleet was prepared to face almost any naval threat except enemy carriers, and if they happened to catch him and his fleet off guard, they would most likely be obliterated. The Vice Admiral did not know where the US carriers were, but he knew the entire region was under a broad umbrella of Australian air coverage, and the long trip to Guadalcanal would be grueling and intense. On the morning of August 8th, Mikawa's fleet journeyed north of Buka Island, taking a daring route through the Slot, a treacherous stretch of the New Georgia Sound. Suddenly, the Japanese fleet came into contact with USS S-38 in St. George Channel, in a tense encounter that threatened to unravel Mikawa's plan. Nevertheless, the moment led to a stark warning by the Allied ship, and Mikawa did not pursue the vessel. Instead, he dispersed his ships near Bougainville, a maneuver designed to conceal the size and intent of his force. At the same time, he dispatched float planes to scout the southern Solomons for Allied ships, collecting crucial intelligence for the imminent battle. Meanwhile, 2 Royal Australian Air Force Hudson reconnaissance aircraft spotted Mikawa's fleet. In response, Mikawa swiftly directed his fleet to veer off their course to confuse the trailing aircraft. Strangely, the Australian planes broke off their pursuit after a few brief minutes, deviating from the protocol to tail the ships continuously. Thus, against all odds, Mikawa found himself unhampered. The Australian aircraft did report the moving fleet, but its presence was dismissed as inconsequential to the Allied forces converging on Guadalcanal, and there was no scramble to intercept it. Moreover, the Allies were not overly concerned about Mikawa's force, as its size appeared considerably small, and it seemed to be moving away from any crucial Allied position. Mikawa planned to sweep to the south side of Savo Island, and torpedo the Allied ships off Guadalcanal, then shift east and north to destroy the Tulagi landing forces. After the assault, the Japanese fleet was to proceed around the north perimeter of Savo Island and withdraw from the area as soon as possible. Simultaneously, the Allied forces, unaware of the impending danger, faced their own challenges. Admiral John S. McCain Sr. assumed that the slot was under surveillance all day, despite failing to order extra reconnaissance missions on August 8th. However, the scouting planes of the cruiser force remained unused, docked, and filled with fuel, posing an explosive risk. Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, the strategic mind in charge of the landing operations, was confident in his belief that the extensive air reconnaissance network provided by Australia would give him ample warning if any significant force ventured close to his location. Even when informed of approaching Japanese ships, his reaction was not one of alarm, but caution. He requested additional reconnaissance missions, striving to leave no stone unturned to secure his landing operation. However, Gormley was unaware of a crucial fact. Logistical complications would prevent these missions from ever taking place. Meanwhile, Mikawa and his fleet stealthily closed in on Guadalcanal. Admiral Turner, commander of the Allied forces, had the enormous responsibility of protecting the entire amphibious operations in the region. He divided the force into 3 elements to cover different areas around the landing zones. But these efforts were compromised by limitations in their primitive shipborne radar and fatigue-induced miscommunication. To address many of the issues they were having, Turner, along with Admiral Victor Crutchley and Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, convened at 8:55 p.m. on Turner's command ship off Guadalcanal. This meeting would leave the southern group without Crutchley's leadership, disrupting the command chain. As midnight approached, Mikawa's force drew closer and closer to Guadalcanal, releasing 3 float planes for reconnaissance and battlefield illumination. Although several Allied ships detected these aircraft, no threat was perceived or reported due to the ongoing confusion and fatigue. A perfect storm was brewing. A false sense of security had lulled the Allied forces, and they were confident that their several surveillance networks would warn them of an impending attack, while at the same time squandering every opportunity to intercept Mikawa when he was sighted. Exhausted, disorganized, and suffering from poor leadership and communication, the sailors patrolling the waters around Savo Island were about to face one of the most harrowing nights of their lives, as the Japanese sailors, meticulously trained for a night battle, dashed towards them. In a single column, Mikawa's force approached. Through the utter darkness, Japanese lookouts spotted USS Blue 9 kilometers ahead. Meanwhile, the menace remained utterly invisible to the US sailors. The stage was set for the Battle of Savo Island, one of World War II's most intense naval showdowns. The area surrounding the landing zones in Guadalcanal was kept under vigilant surveillance by a fleet of 10 Allied ships. This force consisted of 2 light cruisers, 4 heavy cruisers, and 4 destroyers. These vessels were strategically divided into 3 squadrons, 2 fleets, each boasting 4 ships, the Allied southern and northern forces, and a duo of light destroyers guarding the eastern flank. As Mikawa closed in on the contentious waters around Savo Island, he launched 3 float planes with a 2-fold task to locate Allied ships' precise location and ignite flares marking the onset of the battle. However, in another baffling protocol breach, even though the 2 light destroyers guarding the eastern front caught sight of these aircraft, they did not report their presence. Almost 44 minutes past midnight on August 9th, the razor-sharp eyes of the Japanese lookouts proved their worth. The Japanese formation spotted USS Blue, while the sailors aboard the US vessel detected the enemy's presence. Capitalizing on this, Mikawa executed cunning, evasive maneuvers to infiltrate the eastern front undetected, coming to less than a mile from USS Blue at one point. Soon, the Japanese fleet had breached the Allied perimeter. With his fleet now within the waters of the landing zones, Mikawa ordered his ships to disengage from the flagship and operate autonomously. They soon came across USS Jarvis, an American vessel heavily damaged in a previous skirmish, and on her way to Australia for repairs. IJN Unagi, a Japanese destroyer, peeled off from the primary formation to engage the wounded US ship. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Japanese fleet moved stealthily towards the recently detected Allied southern force, which lay ahead, unaware of the night stalkers. The Japanese float planes then released flares, casting an eerie glow over the southern force. As the ocean around them lit up, a hellish battle erupted. The Allied sailors were thrust into chaos, struggling to make sense of the fast unfolding situation, while their vessels bore the brunt of the Japanese assault. HMS Canberra, the ship closest to the onslaught, sustained most of the damage. Despite losing her captain and power, Canberra miraculously evaded 11 torpedo strikes as she maneuvered deftly amid the scorching battle zone. Severely damaged, but having miraculously avoided being swallowed by the sea, the battered US vessel attempted to retreat from the ambush. The Japanese offensive shifted its focus to the second Allied ship, USS Chicago. A torpedo struck Chicago near her bow, and a relentless barrage of gunfire decimated her mainmast. The American sailors, blinded, taken by surprise, and already exhausted, strained to pivot their guns toward their assailants, and when they finally managed, they only inflicted minor damage on IJN Tenryu. Chicago then veered east, making a desperate retreat from the battlefield, leaving the two remaining destroyers isolated and without instructions. After exchanging sporadic fire with the Japanese, these wounded destroyers exited the fray, allowing the Japanese formation to proceed north. Partially due to the Southern Group's lack of leadership caused by Admiral Victor Crutchley's absence, none of the retreating Allied vessels reported the fatal encounter that had just unfolded, granting Mikawa and his fleet a chance to execute yet another ambush. The Allied northern force came under the radar of Mikawa's keen eyes, a scant 9 miles ahead. Once again, the Allied forces fell entirely and failed to identify the approaching threat. The Japanese struck their unsuspecting foes by unleashing a barrage of torpedoes and bringing down the sharp beams of their searchlights. The Allied sailors were jolted out of their calm patrol as a relentless hail of fire set ablaze the deck of USS Quincy, inflicting substantial damage. Making a valiant stand, Quincy retaliated. Despite the inferno growing on her deck, the fierce American gunners managed to find the Japanese flagship amid the blinding lights and take out 36 sailors, narrowly missing Mikawa himself. But the attack was overwhelming, and soon 2 torpedoes found their mark on Quincy, leaving her a blazing wreck, no longer fit for battle. The sailors, still stranded inside the burning shipwreck, fought to abandon the ship and rescue their fellow men deep inside the warship's hull. Meanwhile, the Japanese guns set their sights on USS Vincennes, igniting her floatplane fuel and engulfing the deck in a ruthless firestorm. The Japanese then sealed the fate of Vincennes with 2 well-aimed torpedo strikes, after which her captain gave the harrowing order for the crew to abandon the ship. Then it was USS Astoria's turn to bear the onslaught of Mikawa's fury. The Japanese forces quickly brought their firepower to bear upon her as the crew inside scrambled to their battle stations. Amid the chaos, and in a desperate move highlighting the Allies' precarious situation, Astoria's captain rushed to the deck, attempting to identify the aggressor on his own. An air of confusion gripped the US Navy sailors. Incredibly, Astoria's commander called for a ceasefire, uncertain if they were firing upon friendly vessels. However, when Astoria realized they had been firing at enemy vessels and returned to the offensive, it was too late. Heavy shelling had already incapacitated 3 of her main guns. In a horrifying instant, she was a smoldering wreck. In the heart of the battle, US destroyers Helm and Wilson fought against the encroaching darkness as they strained to spot the elusive Japanese vessels. Despite their best efforts, their sporadic bursts of retaliatory fire failed to inflict any damage on Mikawa's stealthy cruisers. Miraculously, they emerged unscathed amidst the hail of gunfire. At 2:16 a.m., the deafening roar of Japanese artillery around the Northern Allied force began to fade into the distance. Mikawa's forces, having exhausted their firepower and venturing out of range, skated around the north side of Savo Island, leaving behind an eerie silence. Yet, the respite was short-lived. USS Ralph Talbot found herself in the unwelcome spotlight as she stumbled upon Furutaka, Tenryu and Yubari just as they cleared Savo Island. The Japanese vessel's searchlights locked onto Ralph Talbot like predatory eyes, and a volley of gunfire soon followed. The heavy onslaught left her significantly battered, yet, in an act of sheer grit, Ralph Talbot managed to slip away into a nearby rain squall. Having accomplished one of the most decisive naval victories in the Pacific theater, the Japanese fleet retreated north, leaving behind the remnants of 3 sunken US heavy cruisers and a bevy of destroyers scampering for safety. The toll of the naval encounter was heavy for the Allies. Over 1,000 sailors perished, while the Japanese only suffered 58 casualties. This striking disparity underscored the overwhelming victory Mikawa had secured, one of the most significant defeats of the US Navy. But the night was not over for Mikawa. Moments after sailing away, Mikawa and his staff found themselves in a crucial discussion, determining the next course of action. The option on the table was to re-engage with the surviving Allied warships and try to obliterate the Allied transports conducting the landing operations. After all, that was their original mission. But Mikawa was concerned. His fleet was widely dispersed and would need a substantial amount of time to reassemble. The laborious task of reloading their torpedo tubes would further delay their operation. Mikawa was also in the dark regarding the exact count and location of any remaining Allied warships, and the dread of American carriers being sent to hunt him down heavily influenced his reasoning. Additionally, his vessels had depleted a large portion of their ammunition. The experienced Japanese Vice Admiral was also aware that the Japanese Navy had ceased production of heavy cruisers, meaning any loss sustained in a potential air attack the next day would be irreplaceable if he decided to stay near Guadalcanal. However, he didn't know the US carriers had withdrawn from the battle zone and would pose no threat. While several of Mikawa's staff fervently suggested an attack on the Allied transports, the majority consensus leaned towards withdrawing from the battle area. Consequently, Mikawa made the critical decision to order his ships to retreat. In a twist of fate, this decision stopped the Japanese from turning a decisive victory into what could have been a massive strategical triumph. According to US strategists, had Mikawa pushed forward to the landing zones, he could have torn through the over 80 defenseless transport ships engaged in unloading operations at Guadalcanal. Such a sweeping offensive in the Pacific could have dealt a devastating blow to the Allied forces. Nevertheless, the incredible Japanese victory at the Savo Island battle threw a wrench at the gears of Operation Watchtower. The landing was interrupted while the Allies could secure the waters around the landing zones. This left the American troops already on land low on supplies and forced to fight without reinforcements for several weeks. The Allies maintained a vital lifeline to Guadalcanal in the following months, sending supplies and reinforcements via small transport convoys, primarily during daylight. Simultaneously, Allied aircraft from the New Hebrides, Henderson Field, and any available aircraft carriers executed protective sorties to prevent anything like the ambushes of the Battle of Savo Island from happening again. Even with limited resources and reinforcements, the Allied forces on Guadalcanal managed to secure just enough ammunition and supplies to fend off several Japanese attempts to reclaim the islands.